Elias Calder pressed the trigger as the world dissolved into a slit of cold air and the hammer clicked, a single heartbeat snapping across the field. Dust rose from a floorboard as he steadied the rifle against the ruin of a doorway, the wood biting his cheek. A faint rustle of hay, the hush of a distant river, and the sour sting of oil and smoke hung in his nostrils. He exhaled slow, counting the shifts of a wind that refused to cooperate, and set his sights where the keyhole of a door would not betray him to a careless eye. The 200-meter distance loomed like a wall of frost, a line drawn between him and a Confederate general who would soon move behind that door, blind to the world beyond the oaken iron of his own bravado. The room in which the general stood looked less like a chamber of war than a tomb for promises. A brazier glowed with the last of its coals, and the air carried the tang of spent powder and scorched wool. The general wore the grey of authority and the weight of campaigns, his cloak catching a draught that threaded through the keyhole. Elias listened to the drumbeat of distant artillery, a percussion that pulsed in his ears and steadied his hands. A whisper of leather and leather-stamp scent drifted from the seat near the door where a signal officer waited for orders. "Range holds at 1 in 200 meters, the unnamed spotter whispered, voice clipped and precise. "No change in wind since last report. Low valley gusts, nothing strange here. Keep it steady," Elias answered, the cadence in his voice as clean as a rifle barrel after oiling. "If the wind shifts, I'll hear it in my blood before I see it in the leaves." He brushed his finger along the stock and felt the cold, hard grain bite into his palm, a reminder that every inch of wood and metal he trusted had learned the weather of many winters. The door frame beneath his shoulder bore the memory of 100 frost-bitten mornings. He pressed his left thumb into a seam, the wood rasping against his glove as if trying to remind him of the world outside this one purpose. The rifle's weight shifted with the breath in his lungs, and he could hear the whisper of the metal, feel the slight spiraling of the rifling as it prepared to seize its own moment. "Cold as a grave," the spotter murmured, almost to himself, the words rising and falling with his breath. "But a shot like this always has a voice behind it, even in silence." "Not a voice," Elias replied, his eyes never leaving the keyhole, the thin line of iron and darkness that would be the bullet's tunnel. "A memory. And a rumor that travels farther than a man ever could." He flashed the smallest of smiles, brief as a spark off steel, and checked the crosshairs again, his pupils narrowing until the room and the world beyond it dissolved into a single bead of light. In the hall outside, boots shuffled, damp leather against stone, the creak of a floorboard, the click of a sword belt. The general moved, a figure of authority who believed the world would remember him if only his words were loud enough, or his march was long enough. He paused at the door, his shoulder brushing the rough edge of the weathered wood, and the room seemed to hold its breath for a long, impossible second. "Eyes on you, Captain," the general snorted to himself, though there was no captain there to hear him. The words carried through the corridor with a metallic tang, a reminder that every position held a vulnerability, every door an invitation to be opened, every key a possibility of fate. Elias's head swam with the memory of other doors opened by other keys, some by rain and others by the simple accident of a hunter's breath. Tonight the keyhole would do more than hold a latch. It would become the conduit of a decision that would tilt the balance of fear and pride across a nation. The spotter's voice broke through the murmur of the moment. "Wind wants to sneeze left. 4 inches in the shot if you ride it right." 4 inches, Elias repeated, tasting the words like a dry mouthful of powder. "That's a mile in air and a shadow in the eye." He steadied the breath again, the world thinning to a line of sight. A silvered thread stretched from his cheek to the brass keyhole that would betray the general's fate. A faint clatter echoed from the distance, a signal of sentries, and the cautious pace of a besieged fortress. The general moved again, and with him the world shifted, dust motes rising in a lazy dance, the room brightening with the glow of the brazier, a brass hinge kissing the air as if silently cursing the fate of men who played at gods. "Focus," the spotter whispered, the word almost a prayer in a language of dust and steel. "Do not break the line." Elias did not answer. He drew a careful breath, the cold air filling his lungs with the iron taste of resolve. His left hand settled the rifle's forend, the ring of the trigger now a spring waiting to snap true. The general's shadow moved across the door's edge, a dark stain widening as the man stepped closer to the frame, to the danger of a single moment that could end a life or alter a war. "Footfalls," the spotter went on, the cadence counting down with a patience that belonged to soldiers who had learned to live with the weight of a world on a single rifle's breath. Shift in the corridor, a lodestone of dust. Target still at the keyhole, still at the heart of your chance. Elias's eye hovered over the crosshairs, as if the weapon itself could feel the gravity of the shot and resist its own fate. The room hummed with 1,000 other voices, wheels on a cart, the distant clack of a switch, the far-off roar of artillery that seemed to rattle the very stone of the city. Then came the click, the familiar, flat sound of a hammer meeting primer, followed by a quiet space that swallowed all sound and stitched it into the quiet of iron. The rifle's barrel hummed a moment in the air, a low, malevolent note that sounded more like fate than metal. The general, who had believed his own shadow to be a shield, blinked once, a quick, human reaction to the sudden chill in the corridor. He stepped closer to the door, his hand hovering near the knob as if thinking to turn it and demand a different fate from the lock. "Now," Elias whispered to the corridor. Not to the spotter, but to the world that contained this door. This keyhole, this single line of opportunity. He exhaled, and the breath turned to mist, a pale ghost of a thought that drifted toward the iron barrel sink of his weapon. The keyhole became a channel through which the night would pour its last secrets. The bullet found its flight, traveling with a sudden deadness that is only possible in a moment when a man's life unfolds into a single unerring second. The noise of the room seemed to flatten into a single note, like the sound of a thin wire vibrating in a winter wind. There was a flash, a tiny, jagged flare as lead met courage, and the general's face, the very blur of authority, twisted into surprise and then into a numb, sinking calm. The bullet, passing through the keyhole, carved a straight line through the man's eye, a wound that did not simply end a life, but sealed the door to his next breath. The world beyond the hall fell away, as if the air itself had been sucked out of the chamber. The general's jaw slackened. The color drained from his cheeks in a pale, startling way. He reached for the door frame as if to anchor himself to something outside the assault of fate. His fingers brushed the cold wood and then slid away, leaving him to stagger backward, the back of his legs finding purchase on a wooden crate. "God Almighty," the aide whispered, though no deity would alter what had just occurred, or what would follow. "He's fallen. Eyes, I saw it through the keyhole, through the door, through the wall. Keep your mouth closed and your hands steady," another man hissed, his voice thick with fear and the tremor of duty. "Jesus, what have you done?" Elias heard their words, but they were distant, like the sound of rain miles away on a winter night. His heart seemed to surge and then quiet, as if the world had decided to forgive him for this one act, but not the world that would come after. The room smelled of burnt powder oil, hand-oiled linen, an odor that clung to the tongue and made the throat burn with memory. The general's eye had gone pale in a way that was almost unnatural, as if the life itself were being drawn from him through that small, forbidden hole in the door. The general's aide, an older man with a face carved into stone by experience, fell to the ground, his breath ragged as he clung to the edge of a crate for support. "Medic, we need a medic!" he cried, the demand breaking through his fear with a stubborn insistence that would not yield. "Medic cannot mend what a single shot has decided," the spotter said, his voice low and bare, stripped of bravado. "The eye is a line to the soul and to the end of a man's mercy." "And the line ends here," Elias replied softly, his own voice barely more than a breath. He had not moved from his position, not even for a moment, and yet the world had moved around him as if the ground itself had learned a new gravity. The weapon cooled in his hands, the barrel a sleek, cold length of truth, the corridor filled with a different kind of noise, the rush of men who recognized the fall of a man who had believed himself invincible. Boots clattered, leather straps slapped, and the steady drip of a leaking pipe added a rhythm to the chaos. The smoke thickened, curling along the ceiling, and the temperature rose a few degrees as non-combatants scurried to shield themselves from the inevitable recoil of the moment. "Cover that door," the general's chief of staff barked, his voice a tack on a chalkboard, precise and unyielding. "No one crosses the threshold until we know where the shot came from." "Nobody moves," the guard on the far flank commanded, though his own nerves hummed louder than the instrument he carried. "We hold this hall. We keep the line." The general's body slumped against the door, his cloak catching the light of a fading flame, the smoky air bending around him like the final act of a storm. The man who had commanded countless marches and signed a multitude of orders lay still, his eyes unfocused and dull with the sudden end of the journey. In the aftermath, the room seemed to grow quiet again, but the quiet was the hush that follows the fall of a tree in a forest, an ominous, almost sacred stillness that the living do not quite know how to endure. The spotter's breath came in ragged bursts, the chest rising and falling with such speed it appeared he might lift off the floor with a sudden gust of air. "Is he dead?" a whispered voice asked from the darkness beyond the room, a voice that sounded younger, more frightened than the others. "Dead," the aide answered, his tone flat and final, as if he were naming a storm that had already hit and would never be undone. The eye through the keyhole. The general's jaw contracted once, a twitch as if the breath had paused in his lungs to see if the world would relent. Then the life he had lived, his battles, his triumphs, his alliances and betrayals began to drift away, the weight of history lifting from his shoulders and leaving only the cold, empty room and the cold, dead truth of a keyhole's line. Elias moved again only when the last echo of the shot had faded into the walls and the smoke had thinned enough to reveal the room's layout in its stark reality. He did not look back at the door or the keyhole, though his eyes would always remember the exact moment they found a line in the world and followed it with a patient, unerring patience. "Take the rifle," the spotter murmured, his voice almost gentle now, as if to a frightened animal. "We'll push the retreat, lay low. The roads are not safe." Elias did not reply. He laid the rifle down with the care of a man who knew every breath of its history, every mark of its years of service. The cold touch of the wood on his fingertips felt like a memory of 100 hunts and a single, unforgettable shot. The hall's sounds shifted again, the whispered curses of those who remained, the coughs and stifled sobs of men who realized they stood in the path of something they did not understand. The door to the room remained open a crack, a thin sliver of illumination that allowed a shaft of light to paint the dust into golden motes. Hovering like tiny, frightened spirits, outside, the city's ringing bells answered the distant calls of victory or revenge. The clang of metal and the whir of wheels carried a rhythm that Elias could imagine would be the tempo of many days to come. He thought of his home, of the quiet streets where the air tasted of rain and chimney smoke, of the names that would never know his name and the faces he would never see again. The war, he knew, would not end with this one shot, but it would be counted in the lines etched into the faces of the men who survived it and the ones who did not. The spotter's voice interrupted the quiet again, more controlled now but still edged with a tremor. "If there's any justice, this one shot will become a hinge in the war, a moment where the chain of command buckled and could not recover. It already is a hinge," Elias answered, his words crisp, barely above a whisper. "A line drawn in a doorway that will be remembered long after the door itself is buried in the dust." He looked at the keyhole again, the metal's ring catching a stray ray of light, turning the hole into a pupil that had watched a life end and a change begin. The rifles and the men who carried them would move away from that ruin and from the city, as all armies do after such a moment, with the knowledge that some marks remain on the land even when the army leaves. Elias's mind wandered to the many miles that lay between the line of rifles and the civilization his own people occupied. The miles filled with stories of those who had learned to live by the endurance of a single, solitary shot. The hours wore on in a fashion that felt both eternal and trivial, the human animals' worry about meals and shelter colliding with the inhuman math of war. The general's staff prepared for prayers and a formal response to the death that would soon be announced to the soldiers who worshipped him in the same way they worshipped the banner under which they marched. The city's people, those who still walked its streets despite the shelling, would whisper about the shot in the days to come, some calling it a miracle, others calling it a blasphemy. For Elias, the day would be remembered as a line that separated the old war from the new. In the quiet after the storm, a ragged dog nosed its way through the doorway's broken threshold, its breath hot and sour as it sniffed the air for traces of powder. The dog's tail wagged once, then fell still as the creature found a corner and curled up as if to sleep, though the world around it was not sleeping at all. The smell of the animal's fur, wet, muddy, and slightly acrid from the scent of urine, mingled with the room's other odors in a way that brought a strange, almost human sense of mercy to Elias's heart. The dog's quiet created a moment of almost holy humanity amidst the cold machinery of war. "Let the men rest," the spotter said, "not as a command but as a promise. We will move at first light, When the fog lifts from the river and the ground stops answering with every step we take. Yes, Elias replied, though he spoke to no one, knowing that the answer lay in his own quiet now. He retrained his gaze, not toward the keyhole, but toward a line of horizon that promised something beyond the city's ruin. The rifle lay across his lap, and his hands rested, exhausted but not broken, the weight of the moment still pressing against his chest. The general's death did not bring the kind of glory that wars sometimes manufacture for their heroes. It brought a pause, a heavy, almost necessary pause before the next storm. The room's air carried a stale breath of smoke that clung to the walls and to Elias's coat. The scent of iron and earth born of fires long since cooled. He felt the world lean toward the future with a quiet oath. A vow to honor what had happened by living to tell its truth without embellishment. The dawn came with a pale light that pooled in the room, a soft, clinical white that bled into the shadows where the bodies of men lay still, and the living moved with hurried caution. The city woke with that peculiar blend of fear and relief that follows a night of violence. A morning after the night when the line between life and death had briefly become a thread thin as spider silk, then someone, somewhere, had to decide whether to snip it. Elias did not watch the sun rise. He trained his eye on the door's threshold, listening to every creak as if it might reveal the sound of a horse's hooves in the distance, a sign that the enemy would be upon them if they hesitated even a moment longer. The spotter, standing as if drawn into the dust by the simplest of commands, kept the campfire of a quiet vigil burning between his lips. Move with caution. The voice of the spotter reminded more to the men around him than to Elias, yet the instruction felt as binding as a soldier's oath. We vanish when the time is right, not before. Where to? A quiet, almost childlike voice asked in the hall. The speaker, a rankless whisper of a man who still believed that a line drawn on a map could be redrawn by the will of men who had never learned to measure death against the color of a flag. South, the spotter answered, and the word sounded like a confession, a decision that would alter every mile and every posture of the men who carried the weight of it. We slip past the river, where the fog lies thick and the guards are more afraid of what they cannot see than of what they can. Elias rose once more, a silhouette against the pale morning. The general lay in a room that would never again be a mere room, but a memory etched into the walls of anyone who would set foot within them. He did not look at the door or the keyhole again. Instead, he looked out at the street where the dawn's light spilled over the cobbles, painting them in a glassy gold that could fool a man into thinking that peace might someday come to the land. And so the sniper left that ruined doorway with the same careful steps that had brought him there. He did not run, for that would betray the discipline that had sustained him through nights of watch and long days of travel. He moved as a hunter moves, with a patient, nearly spiritual restraint, aware that the war's future might hinge on his ability to vanish without a trace into a landscape that did not yet know it was being rewritten. His exit was a silent, almost ceremonial departure, the sort of departure that would be whispered about in kitchens and taverns in towns far from here, a rumor that would take root in the memory of all who bore witness to the day. A general's life ended through a keyhole and a whisper of steel. The doors closed behind him like the final page of a diary, and the world outside continued to breathe, which, in this war, was often the only mercy any man could claim. Hours later, the scene settled into a kind of stillness that felt almost holy, as if the city itself held its breath to acknowledge the turning point that had occurred within its walls. The general's death would ripple outward in ways that Elias could hardly predict, shaping orders and counter-orders, the movement of regiments, and the quiet fear that next door could be a room in which a different shot might choose another moment to fall. In the days that followed, the campaign pressed on with a force that was at once unpredictable and inevitable. Elias knew there would be a price to pay for the act that occurred within that door. Other eyes would turn toward the keyhole, and other hands would seek to replicate the certainty that had carried the bullet to its mark. Some would doubt the story. Others would claim it as myth. But for a space of a few moments a line had been crossed, and the world had learned that the war could be altered by a single patient strike against a door's narrow. Unassuming witness, the twist of fate would not pause to ask permission. It would not seek a narrative that would flatter the valiant or absolve the cruel. It would simply move forward, propelled by the iron will of men who believed that power lay not in the loudness of a drumbeat, but in the quiet, decisive moment when a door's keyhole becomes a lens through which the future can be glimpsed and forever changed. Elias did not celebrate the act, nor did he mourn it with a heavy heart. He carried no medals for this moment, no cheers, no songs. He carried only the sense that a line had been drawn and a road had opened that did not lead back to the world as it was. He walked that road in silence, with the same careful, almost reverent silence he had used to take the shot. He kept to the shadows, to the hints of old streets and old rivers that knew his name only as a rumor in the wind. And so, a single shot through a keyhole, at 200 meters, would be remembered, not merely for its distance or its precision, but for the way it forced a war to reckon with the fragility of those who believed themselves to be beyond the reach of fate. Elias Calder would live on in the memory of those who stood on the edge of the smoke and the dust, a figure unseen except for the telltale glint of a steel barrel and a quiet resolve that refused to be broken by the noise of battle. The day did not end with a banner raised in victory or a trumpet call to parade. It ended with a hush and a belief that war, in its most intimate and terrifying form, is a series of moments like this one, where a door, a keyhole, and a single breath can alter the future of a nation. Elias walked away from the ruin and toward a road that curved toward the unknown, his step measured and sure,